Welcome everyone, as Old World is brought to bear. A 4X strategy game coming from Mohawk Studios, a team with members including the lead designer of Civilization 4 and Off-World Trading Company. There is a pretty hefty pedigree in this team, and they definitely knew what they were doing when they started on this project. But what sets Old World out against all the others is the game really does set itself up to ensure you're playing out a story, creating a narrative through your ruler through a series of different events, as well as taking into consideration your actions within the campaign itself. Now we will be taking a look at the options as always, but I just want to point something out before I do, and that is that if we go into audio, I currently have music, recording, and streaming copyright safety mode on. And if we go ahead and start bringing this down, you can see so many of these tracks have now been turned off or being grayed out and disabled. So unfortunately, you're not going to hear the full extent of the soundtrack during this video, something that is rather annoying because these are pretty darn good, but unfortunately they are copyright protected. If you're wanting to stream this, making sure you turn that on, but otherwise making sure it's turned off because the game just sounds so much better without it. Now there is a ton to go through just from our main options screens, but if you want to skip forward to the gameplay, I'll put a timestamp in the description, so feel free to check down there if you just want to hop straight in. With that said, let's go back to our options menu and see just how much you're able to change. Since Old World is a PC game coming from Mohawk Studio, a seasoned team including members who worked on the Civilization and Off-World Trading Company series, they are affording a ton of options, and rightly so. And the first one to pick up, and a big recommendation here, is that you leave tutorialization on at least at the start, making sure to read through as much of it as you can, as there is a ton to learn here, and even for 4X gamers, you're probably going to have a few things you're going to need to check up on, at least at the very beginning. Later on down the line, feel free to turn this off. There is an option here for it, or more accurately, turn on disable tutorial. Darn you double negatives. The last one before we move on to graphics, I will pick out this email system. This is something you'll be needing if you want to use their cloud saves, with the other options just being ways to change how the game plays and your own personal tastes for unit cycling, movement, as well as what can be followed from the AI movements. Next up we have our graphics, and something that I will note, I've tried playing around with this a bit and switching between GPU rendering on and off. I've tried changing the rendering qualities to lower. There's just some performance issues. I haven't been able to get rid of them all. I have been able to improve them, but not to any significant extent. That said, even when they've been at their worst, particularly in the mid to late game when you've found a ton of different factions and there's a whole lot of moving parts, it still is playable. I haven't had anything completely break the system, there haven't been any crashes, it just chugs along a bit. Now when it comes to generating the maps, you can go onto a smaller scale, and that's a good way to work around this, but it's just something to note that towards the end, as is often seen in many of these 4X games, it just really does slow down, and not just in terms of having to wait for the moves to be completed, particularly when zoomed in on units, but in general, any kind of fighting seemed to affect this quite significantly. So do have a little play around, there are lots of options available. I'll note just before we move on, I'm playing on GTX 1080s with an i7-8700K running at high, the highest option available. Skipping on to audio, as I mentioned at the start, we have recording and streaming copyright safety mode on. There are tons of great tracks in here, so do turn that off when you get the chance. Very sorry I can't do it for you here. You can continue the sound playing when you're alt-tabbed out. Turn all sounds off. You can completely mute this if you want from the menu. I don't know why you would, but the option's there. I take that back, I know exactly why you would. If you're playing this at work, fair play. And then finally adjust your music and effects levels separately. And just a quick note on the languages, I'm playing a preview demo, so there's only access to English and Spanish. However, I will include an image from Steam of all the languages this game currently supports. And it's great to see just another example of all of the options available to you, including changing the keyboard type if you're using an AZERTY's keyboard. But for the rest of the UI, really this is just changing how you interact with the game. And I do find it interesting that the accessibility options are considered separate to the UI, as if we go over to accessibility, it's in here that we're able to change our tooltip size, including removing scaling options. So it may look a little funky or cause overlapping or breaking, but if you want to do this, you are able to actually go in and change the game to pretty much suit anything you need. as well as some options to apply filters to help if you're colorblind. So between the UI and the accessibility, you're able to do a ton to help you out in playing the game however you want. And last but not least, there are full rebindable controls, though I will state you can control pretty much the whole game just from your mouse. And there are times I'd kind of recommend doing so, as often when I've been exploring, I've come across something new, and it gives you the option to rename if you're the first person to find something, such as a mountain or a river. Unfortunately, if you're using the keyboard to move around, it will start typing your movement controls. So I've had a few times I've come across the mountains of R and Waz. It is a little bit annoying that it just captures exactly what you're pressing at the time. But that being said, you are free to rename it to whatever you want, so Waz Mountains and the Azadud River could well be what you end up with. And we're still not done there, as we have plenty of options in the bottom left, allowing you to gain access to all the various communities that have sprouted up around the game. Meaning if you're wanting to go into some multiplayer, you could well hop onto the Mohawk's Discord and find yourself someone else to play against. But if that's the options, we also have additional extras, the Hall of Fame, showing off how well different nations have done, our map editor, meaning you can create any map you want, and it's fairly substantial, though a little bit confusing to use. I'll just load it up now because it's definitely not going to be a large point I can talk about. And I'll let you know here that I'm going to be skipping some of these loading screens, as loading times can be a little brutal in Old World. So the game starts you off in this big old empty space. You can create hexes, whatever type you want, lush land, temperate land, arid land, applying different terrain features such as lakes, although the game is quite laggy at putting those in. Wow. Put our mountains in. It's all fairly easy to figure out, and by adding one, it resets the whole thing to look fairly nice coming together, as well as apply the different starting positions. The rebels over here, our encampment, now belonging to the Numidians. So there's certainly a lot to be done if you're wanting to create some maps for you and your friends, or even share it out with others, guaranteeing plenty of replayability so long as you're willing to put the effort in to learn how to use this and try and create something cool out of it. And the one thing you will note in the map editor is you aren't able to just place down units, so you can't set up the game just to have a massive battle royale or recreate some of those historical battles. Or at the least, I should say, I have not figured out a way how to do it. But given how some of these scenarios play out, I wouldn't be surprised if that comes in the future, is introduced via mods, or there is a way, I just haven't figured it out yet. As I said, the map editor is something I do not know a huge amount about, but it is there, and if it's something you enjoy, go ahead and make good use of it. Our next option, the event browser, lets you go in and start modifying the game to really customize how it plays. We have the encyclopedia, which will teach you about the different aspects of the game, the manual, which will open up in a browser, and the credits for the team. And you can see why I said we're going to be here for a while, because that's just the options and extras. Next up, we have mods, and as you can see, we have a fairly healthy supply of mods available to us, with the first one coming up being the introduction of the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Orthodox religion, as well as some providing more options to how you set up your games. Having already been released over on Epic, the modding scene for the game is alive and doing well, though of course being introduced to Steam will have the Steam Workshop, so I'm expecting that to grow quite a bit over the coming years. Next up, we have multiplayer options, something that unfortunately I won't be testing as I'm playing on a preview review demo, but the options are available to play online in real time, play via the cloud, taking your turns then handing over the game to the next player, taking part in a hot seat on the same computer, as well as host a game on a remote server. There's plenty there, and I've got to say I'm very happy to see the introduction of hot seat and play by cloud. Although I'm not a huge fan of cloud gaming, the ability to take a turn and then shift it over to your friends is just such a great inclusion to see. It just helps take out some of the hassle, and for a turn-based strategy game, it's pretty much perfect. And a final note of classic hot seat gaming, absolute legends. But being a single-player focused gamer, let's take a look at our single-player options. First off, we have the Game of the Week, posing a bit of a challenge and just a nice one to jump in and out of if you see one that takes your fancy. Our scenarios, which we'll come back to soon, this is where we'll find the Heroes of the Aegean, which if you're wanting to hear a little bit more about what's specifically in the Heroes of the Aegean DLC, I am making a separate video on this and you can find the links in the description, as well as Rise of Carthage, your tutorial Learn to Play, alongside some of the different maps available, as well as the Horde mode for the game, the Barbarian Horde. We'll have to see how long you can survive against the sheer quantity of raiders that will appear and assault your nation. It's all great to see and we'll take a look at it soon, but for now, let's start up a new game. So far everything has been set up pretty similar to other 4X titles, in particular looking at Civilization, which makes a lot of sense given that the lead developer for a Civ game went ahead and made Mohawk Studios. But where the game does differ quite substantially is in a fairly small amount of different nations to play as. You have Assyria, Babylonia, Carthage, Egypt, Greece, Persia, and Rome, with the final two options being randomly selected for you, as well as picking your nation when you first settle the city. I'm guessing you could use this one to really fine-tune who would be best in the given area, but so far I've mostly just been playing on random. So you do have a slight limitation to begin with in what nations you can play as, but with that said, when moving through our characters, we can see just how differently these will play, at least in the early game. Each faction will begin with a different starting technology, thus changing the level of progression of each nation and how you'll initially start off founding your empire. Atop this, you'll have unique units, 2 for each, as well as your various shrines and temples. But where the game really shows off how the characters play differently is via their families. When founding each of your settlements, you'll have to hand them over to one of their families, thus providing different bonuses, with some giving you additional units or additional orders, changing the laws, or even giving you access to recruitment that you may otherwise have been unable to acquire. And finally, we have the leader archetype, something that if you're min-maxing will become incredibly important, but honestly, for a casual 4X gamer as myself, it's not something to worry about, but something more to keep in mind. As we can see here with Dido of Carthage, she is the diplomat archetype. Because of this, she can serve as governor or ambassador, affording different bonuses depending on her position, as well as leaning her towards missions of national alliances and tribal alliances. And if we compare this to Hatshepsut, they are the builder archetype. They can work as governor or chancellor. As governor, they provide a reduction of build improvements by 1 turn, as well as being able to add urban tiles, allow multiple workers to work on improvements, and reduce old production time for workers by 50% in all cities. An extremely noticeable difference, particularly given how they begin with the labor force, allowing them to create roads, gaining additional orders, and setting the nation up to gain navigation and phalanx fairly early on. It does, on paper, give each faction a clear playstyle and clear differences between them, keeping them all nice and unique. Not to mention, if we go into our bio, you can learn about the real-life history of the individuals, including that they wore a metal beard. Interesting. Now going on to the simple setup, if you're just wanting to quickly get in, this pretty much gives you everything you need. You can adjust your difficulty going from the able at the lowest all the way up to the great, changing the amount of resources you'll start with, as well as the aggression levels of your enemies, the chance of rebellion, the resources you generate each turn, and finally the starting level of other nations. The most important part though, as well as select between a randomly generated and pre-made map. The pre-made maps are the same as those you'll find in the scenarios, whereas random map, of course being absolutely random, will allow you to put some small constraints, roughly deciding how it will play out, choosing the map script, giving a base template for the biome, as well as change your map size, with the final option presets probably being the most unique to the old world. It's in here that you'll be able to adjust the rate at which you see events, not to mention the amount of information you're given as to what those events will do, allowing you to play in more of a role-playing manner and really dedicating yourself to the narrative focus of the game, as well as allowing you to choose from different challenge modes such as One City, Chess mode, and Punishing, all designed to make the game a little bit more trixier and just increase that replayability. Whereas in moving over to advanced setup, you can entirely tailor the way each game is generated, from the number of nations present, the mortality of your characters, the frequency of events, not to mention more standard fare such as toggling fog of war, and affecting the resource densities. So also here you'll have your options for seeding, so if you have managed to find a good seed elsewhere, it's in your advanced setup that you'd put this in. But if you're playing this yourself, feel free to go through and adjust all of this to your preference. The only thing I'm really going to pick up on is something players, myself included, may not notice at first, but you can go in and change the victory conditions. Now, as standard, the game will play with a timed victory on, meaning that at the end of 200 turns, whoever has the most victory points will win. And we will have a look at a campaign I've been playing up to around 40 odd turns, and you can see a fair amount can be done, but 200 turns is definitely not enough time for military expansion and complete map dominance. Well, at least it's not for me. Maybe if you're good at the game, you could rush to it, but I would be more amazed than anything at seeing that. But skipping through the rest of the options, the final one to note is the ability to select mods. So you can pick and choose which ones will be available in this campaign, once more just giving lots of variability to how you play and setting the game up however you like, and giving plenty of versatility to the player to ensure there's loads of replayability. But in loading up our own game, we can finally ask the question, how does it play? Very similar to other 4X titles, particularly those of Civilization. You have your settlers, a bunch of different city sites we can use to begin with the founding of your cities, particularly this first one being the capital, setting up how you'll start your early game. To begin with, this isn't too much of a trouble, but as the game progresses and you're getting more and more settlements, you will need to try and balance these somewhat to ensure your family stay loyal and content in your empire. Before we start, let's take stock of all the different parts of the UI because there is an absolute ton. This is 100% a 4X game and a pretty good example of just how ridiculous these games can be if you're not accustomed to them. So for those who've never played one before, well, let's go through. A little FYI for 4X fans, you can more or less skip this entire section. I'm just going to be explaining kind of what people will be seeing. There are some slight details and mechanics and how they play out, but overall, you're probably going to be best just skipping to the next timestamp. Starting off with our council, we can see all of the characters we have available to us, as well as the possible positions we can put them into. Now, if you're just starting off the game, most of these are going to be closed off, and you'll need to do some research and expand a little before you can start to really get into the nitty-gritty, with only your spouse and heir being immediately active. But once you have finally unlocked some of them, you can start to embark on more of the political and intrigue aspects of the game, in particular looking at the ambassador, allowing you to start negotiating truces, or in the case of our spy master, going about some assassinations. I'm going to skip through the next ones a little bit. The religious considerations of our empire, the various nations we've come into contact with. We can check through our cities, currently only one, Roma, as well as the units available to us. All of these screens becoming increasingly more important as time goes by. In particular, that of religion, as later on in the game when you've made contact with all of the established religions, their influence can gradually spread into your territory, leading you to need to consider whether or not you will change the state religion so as to appease the majority of people in your nation. But all of that's not going to come in for quite a while in your campaign, so moving to something that's a little more apparent. Now, the minimap is kind of intriguing how it works in the game, as when you first start, it will be incredibly zoomed in. There's no way to change that, and this is to signify how much of the world you know and understand. As you move your scouts out and explore and reveal more and more of the map, the minimap also will begin to zoom out, providing you more information of roughly what's going on. Alongside our map, we have a series of different overlays. Now, I'm not going to deny, I really don't understand even half of these, and I think the only one I actually use are roads and rivers overlay. I say it's the only one I use because knowing the exact yield of the different hexes just isn't something that's been necessary in how I've played the game. Now, if you're going after full-blown efficiency, then you are fully catered for in seeing exactly what's happening, with information being readily available should you ever need it. Now, when you begin, you will have a nice hefty supply of resources, depending on your difficulty, that changing with the quantity, but playing on the just difficulty, we have more than enough to see us develop our nation and start expanding our territory. Now, in order to expand this, as you would expect, you can use your workers to move forth and start building the various different structures that will eventually give us additional food, additional iron, additional stone, wood, and orders. The last one being an extremely important resource, as you can only perform as many actions as you have orders available to do so. Now, these first set of resources are what you're going to be using to build structures and expand your empire, as well as recruiting units. Our second set is a little more specialized. we have research, civics, training, and luxuries. From animal furs to dyes to rare stones and gems. Though on the resource panel, they basically all just get lumped together. It's luxury items being used to help sweeten the deal when negotiating or smoothing over your populace to ensure your families don't rebel. It's all fairly straightforward in the base term, with more complexity added to it if you're willing to go into that depth. That is to say that quarries gaining more or less stone depending on the specific hex you place them in. Add to this the hexes around it. If there are other quarries, you could give bonuses. If there are mountains next to them, you also will gain bonuses. Finally, you can add specialists to them. Going to your city and recruiting a stonecutter can give a dramatic increase to how productive your quarries are. But in the most basic form, build the right structure and you'll get more resources. Use those resources to then build more things, and Bob's your uncle. The last thing I will note is the ability to buy and sell these resources. Hovering over them, we can see the price to buy and the price to sell, with quite a disparity between the two of them, all being bought and sold for money. The only exception being orders. Orders can also be bought via training. And this is something the game does not teach you that well, is the fact that you can buy and sell these resources, but more importantly, you can buy additional orders in order to, particularly in the mid to late game, give you a bit of a leg up over your opponents, and something that I only found out you could do yesterday. In fact, there are a ton of little things that dramatically change the way you play. You're just going to have to learn as you go along. What's important to note is that as you are developing the different structures available and gaining additional resources, you're also expanding the influence of your empire. Each region will have its own area of influence, and this border will increase as we expand in structures. Next up, moving to the bottom left, we have various information from the previous turns, providing us additional information such as succession rights, city founding, technologies available, any bonuses that may be in effect or we've gained throughout this level, as well as, most importantly, the reminders section, showing us that we can give ourselves a little boost by providing a governor for Roma. It's a good area to keep your eye on when playing, that as so much is going on, you're inevitably going to miss information. And having it all neatly prepared in the bottom left and simply needing to be hovered over to get the highlights is a great way to learn how the game plays, including learning that there is a maximum civics we can hold, with anything after being converted into research. But if you do find this a little too much, you can hold Alt and right click and remove all of those notifications at any time you wish. Clearing them away, next up is the most important part of the screen, and the one I have most issue with. So in the center, you have your faction's leader, alongside the title they've gained, but we can also see the various characteristics that make them up. All these different attributes will be combined with your various council members in order to provide you the full bonuses for your faction. But what's special for your character is these will also help in the different events and have a much larger impact on your faction than any of the others. To the left of the character is just some additional information about what type of character they are, and a bit more of a breakdown from the bonuses gained in their current positions. Whereas on the right are probably the most important parts of the game. Legitimacy basically marks out how well you're doing at managing your empire. You'll gain this by going forth, exploring, completing ambitions, and gaining different titles, with the titles of your forebears slowly providing less and less legitimacy over time, meaning you are going to need to build up each character as you go, relying on great-great-grandpapa Romulus to see you through the full game. There's something that can also shoot you in the foot, as if you do too much with one character, the ability to acquire titles will increase as the generations go on. It does mean that you could potentially become unable to gain new titles as previous lords were simply too darn good. And that is just yet another consideration in just how in-depth the game is and how much effort you could put into increasing the efficiency of your empire. But the most important part of legitimacy is the amount of orders it will generate. Orders marks the unique selling point of the game and helps keep Old World distinct from other 4X titles. Even if you have 50 units, you will not be able to use them all if you do not have 50 orders. And that's assuming you only do one thing with each unit. If you want to enact multiple move orders or move then attack, that's going to cost you one order per, or for some of the different advancements and improvements for your cities, they could even cost a number of different orders to complete, not to mention while your workers are constructing something, they will be continually taking one order to maintain their construction. the ability to progress your empire, literally living and dying on how you control those orders. Now early on in the game, you're going to have very few, though as the game progresses and you gain more and more titles, but also increase your legitimacy, you'll be able to start earning a fair stockpile of them. But it really does keep the gameplay very unique to Old World. But the final part to note in the bottom left, and the hardest thing to note, are these small little boxes. We have our undo last move and redo last move controls, something that is brilliant. I utterly love the fact that you can undo things and redo them, and should be included in all turn-based strategy games. Next up, our nice bold exclamation mark, providing us notice on any key decisions we have to make. All narrative events are going to pop up here, as well as diplomatic ones. We then have construction, military, scouting, and cities. Clicking on these will allow you to cycle through any idle units, as well as the big button beneath them automatically switching you between events and units as it deems fit. However, the one you might well miss, and something that infuriated me when I was first playing the game, this little square with a tick atop it, is the end year button, and you will need to hit it fairly often, because fairly often you're going to end up having additional moves that you just don't want to use. They're completely pointless. You could use up your orders shifting units back and forth, but you could also hit end turn and sell those orders, something that in the early game could be useful in just keeping you afloat. And finally we come to the top left. Now depending on your victory conditions, you will see a variety of different things on the left hand side. In our case, we're playing without a time limit, so we simply have the different factions available and our current diplomatic state with them. Flags being a truce, whereas the flower, at least that's what I think it is, signifies a negotiated peace. In fact, the only people we're at war with is the tribal nation of Gaul, because I clicked the wrong button during an event and just figured, hey, why not, let's wipe them out. Moving along, we have our menu, help screens, and victory conditions. However, the next set can be incredibly useful. First off, we have our family and inheritance, where we can see a full breakdown of the different characters that have come and gone within our nation. Though you can, if you wish, apply different succession rights, which is a good thing to take stock of if you find your next in line for the throne to be somewhat unworthy, shall we say. But this is a screen that I did not know about until I started poking around for the review, finding that the tutorial entirely leaves it out and it simply hadn't come up in any of the scenarios yet. Moving along with this, we also have our laws. These laws you will unlock as you play and gain access to different technologies, often being initiated by events, meaning you will have the choice as to which ones you take, but knowing that there is a Lords panel you can go back to and change at any time is just another great example of the many things the tutorial has left out. Next on our list, we have our timeline, something that may get a bit of a kick out of, before then being able to bring up our full tech tree and see all of the different research technologies available and just how advanced we can make our nation, with reaching the end of each tech tree affording an additional victory point to the player. And finally, we can bring up a breakdown of our settlements, giving an easy reference to just who's producing what and whoever needs a new quarry to ensure we aren't losing stone to them. The final two are a little bit curious. You can replay the moves over the last turn, allowing you to see what you did previously, something that when clicking does lag the game up a fair bit. And honestly, I see as something that would be pretty useful if you've left the game for a while and aim to come back to it. But our final one is to hide or show the music player. Music requiring us to research drama, with something that, yes, does come fairly early on, though beggars belief that you literally need to research music in the game. And considering that these are randomized selections, and the fact that in order to progress the game and keep up with the AI, you may not even get to have music in your game for quite a while, it's a bit of a brave choice to say the least. But with that, we've finally finished all of the UI and can start having a look at the game, and answer the question, is it any good? Well, in the most basic form, it plays similar to other 4X strategy games. To take control of your nation, to explore, exploit, expand, and exterminate as and how you see fit. Settling your cities, affording them governors, building up different structures in the hexes to exploit the land around them, gaining enough resources to build up an army, training your army, upgrading them, and fighting and exterminating the enemy. And at the base face value, If you've played games like Civilization, you're going to feel right at home with similar styled units, settlers being used to settle cities, workers being used to build things, and your soldiers being afforded from the historical time period. Yes, you'll have basic warriors and axemen, but you'll also be able to develop into some unique units like the Hastata for Romans, before developing your technology to include cavalry, siege equipment, even going so far as introducing the mangonel, and all these military units being available not only to level them up, gaining new traits and improving them, but also to upgrade as your warriors become more and more obsolete, unable to keep up with the brand new heavily armored spearmen. You don't have to rebuild every time, you can just instantly upgrade those units and get your army back fighting fit. Though I do have to say, combat in the game is fairly simplistic. You're not going to be spending a huge amount of time working on flanking or drawing the best units to task. 9 times out of 10, simply ganging up on the enemy with a huge mob is kind of all you'll need to do, particularly when your forces are going up against barbarian factions. Now, when you're going up against an AI opponent or going into multiplayer, you'll need to think a little more and really start to consider all of the different advantages that come with your units. In particular, looking at the skills. As we'll see when going over to the scenario, some of those skills are really overpowered, and you can do a heck of a lot of damage to the enemy by getting things such as coxswain on your ships or rout on your infantry, allowing you to defeat an enemy, pursuing them into their previously held hex, and continue to attack again, an ability that can be re-triggered or fended off by using units such as spearmen, whose polearm prevents them from being routed, and zone of control will block mounted units from running around them. Old World certainly has the basics down when it comes to developing a turn-based fighting game, and I'd rank it pretty high in terms of 4X, but at the end of the day, extermination is only one aspect of a 4X game, and it does feel like the family management and narrative structure of the game is really where the focus is held. But in devising your empire and setting up that narrative, there are some limitations. So you're not going to be able to settle any square on the map. You'll have to look for specific urban tiles. They come up as city sites, provide you somewhere to set up your settlements, something that will require you to either go to war with the various tribes that own them, or really plan out and almost rush to in order to stop the AI from closing off sections. The area of influence to each city is blocked off to other nations until you set up full-blown diplomacy with them, or enact full-blown war, either one. Meaning that although you could use this against the AI, more often than not the AI will find an area, set up, and then have their border actually lock you off from getting around them by going up against impassable terrain. But where the game excels is not in the fact that it is a fairly standard 4X game, at least in terms of its mechanics and the turn-by-turn play. And I say this as if you've played a 4X game before, you're gonna feel right at home here. But that place that it excels is in how it engages with family members. Not only your faction leader themselves gaining various banes and boons, but also the ability to control and decide how your heir will develop. Not to mention who your heir will be. The long-term development options are kind of insane, and if you really look into it, there is a ton of variability in how you set up your empire, how you set up your lineage. And if you're willing to put in the effort, you could make some incredibly powerful families from this, and engage in influential consideration of not only your own family, but those of the families that make up your faction as well. And the game really does encourage you well to consider how you set up your lineage, ensuring your heirs and line of succession is well made, but also who you marry and how you will continue your lineage, what traits will be gained from your parents, and even changing your inheritance system should you need to avoid any unpopular leaders, shall we say, with the narrative being where this game excels most. And that's not a bad thing. With the sheer quantity of events present with well over 1,000 within the game, not only are you able to create your own immersive narratives, but there is a full-blown narrative written on the screen in front of you. Now, you will need to read a fair amount of this to really get the full potential from it. And particularly if you're going for something like a roleplay run where you're not able to see the results of which actions you choose, it forces you to, well, roleplay. And given all the time and effort you'll be putting in to ensure the traits and abilities of your family, Not to mention the effort put into passing those abilities on, the developers of the old world have seen what the game is and built everything around this solid narrative core. And when you combine this with all of the replayability of the sandboxes themselves, then the replayability of Old World is practically endless, with each time you expand gaining new territory, allowing you to set up a settlement underneath the patronage of a different family within your faction, then juggling these to make sure everything goes okay, influencing decisions and acting with a deft hand through your orders to ensure your empire remains as strong as possible to defeat any enemies that may come at you. It is definitely the unique selling point of the game, and something I'm rather impressed, to be honest with you, in how they've gone about setting up, with Old World seeming to have more of a mind frame of the progression, the long-term game being the real aim of the player, as opposed to the turn-by-turn action available. It's an interesting take on a 4X strategy game, and one I have to say is genuinely intriguing. With that said, the real draw of the game for me was actually in the scenarios. And this is something that you will already have access to with the Carthaginian set, but also with the new Heroes of the Aegean. As honestly, 4X Sandbox is all good fun and all, but I much prefer to have some kind of objective, some aim within the game to keep me motivated and actually wanting to finish off a campaign rather than simply playing for 200 years and hoping you did well. And I have to say that the scenarios do an amazing job of contextualizing and really bringing the history to life in a lot of this. Not only will you have yourself playing as some of the most influential generals and leaders of history, but you'll be able to not only reenact but also change, manifest and create your own historical events that made them such renown. Loading up now, we have the Rise of Carthage campaign, where we've completed 9 of our goals, 3 currently active, but we only need 10 to achieve a gold victory. In much the same way as Sandbox, simply completing goals as and when they arrive, these often being presented as a choice, meaning it's going to be a little different each time you play, and with each of them having a turn limit, some of them we've actually missed as we've gone by and simply had to let go. But I figured it was a good opportunity to go through the combat in the game. I say this because so many of our units have been upgraded, promoted, coming from friendly families, happy families, all providing some nice bonuses to our units, and making our attack, defense, and movement rather different between each one of them. It's an interesting take because it does mean that combat plays out, more importantly, how you make the unit as opposed to how you use them. There are certain units such as Hoplite which will need to be adjacent to others in order to gain the full bonus of their defense, but by and large, the optimization puzzle that is 4X gaming even extends to your soldiers, deciding where you recruit them, how you develop them, which generals you add to each unit, and less to do with actually how you use them on the battlefield. And I say this because typically the best method is just to gank the enemy, especially early on when you don't have access to units that can rout the enemy and keep moving through them to attack the next one, getting multiple hits per turn. At the highest end, there is a lot of tactical play involved, but it's going to take you a very long time to get there. Something I think can be said for pretty much the entire game, with most things taking so long to develop into. Now with all that said, there are a few issues with the game. I've already mentioned some of the setup making it unclear exactly where things are and how you'll be controlling them. I've already mentioned some of the issues in regards to tutorialization, leaving even something as simple as finding the end year button something you have to do yourself. Not to mention, going into many of the panels, you'll need to learn these as you go, and paying attention to the loading screens has helped me a lot in learning how to gain additional information from the pop-ups that appear. Now this is definitely something that will affect new gamers to the 4X series, but for returning fans of 4X strategy, it's not really going to hold you back. You can more or less figure out exactly how to play this game just by playing a few rounds. It's just little things that would greatly improve the point of entry, not to mention myself playing and knowing 4X strategy games, but still having to spend a large amount of time learning how this works myself does show that tutorialization is lacking, which is kind of ridiculous given the fact that it gives so much writing. I appreciate that in the narrative context the writing is needed, there's a lot of information but a lot of story, and it does well bringing across that story through it. But when it comes to tutorialization, it needs to be shorter, snappier, and to the point. What is it you want us to do? Why do you want us to do it? And why should we do it again in the future? That is all I need to know. Particularly as when confronted with a wall of text, the chances are you're not going to read every single word, meaning some of the information will get lost as you begin skim reading to get through it quicker. And so it's thanks to this. I still don't fully know the effect of roads. I'm pretty sure it increases the speed at which we move, but unless I hover over the hex, hold down shift to maintain this gap and go over onto road, now we see that it extends our trade network and increases unit movement range. And some awkward, tricksy holding shift middle clicking, I'm not entirely sure how I finally managed to get this to stay. Research, we can move on and find out what trade network means. The trade network consists of all tiles connected to the capital via roads, rivers, urban tiles. Foreign cities on your trade network, which requires national peace, produce money each turn. All of this I didn't know, despite having completed the tutorial and multiple scenarios. Once more showing that the information is there. If you're willing to put the time in to learn all of the different aspects of the game, you could get a pretty hefty challenge out of this and a very in-depth gameplay looking at the mechanics and how they interact, but you really do need to put the effort in to learn it. But will that affect you in the long-term gameplay? No, pretty much all my issues with this game come into the point of entry, and once you're past that, once you've made it over the learning curve, it plays really well. It does exactly what you want it to do. It provides a narrative-driven 4X gaming experience set within a historical time frame. You'll enact diplomacy with other nations, you will build your empire and found your lineage. You'll develop your research to improve your soldiers and go forth and conquer the world. I think the fact that I've played approaching 20 hours at this point, seriously, I keep coming back to this review and just playing a little more, I'm pretty sure that is a sign that the game is good. And honestly, I do look forward to playing a lot more hours in the future, in particular in completing the scenarios. The sandbox element is great for learning how the game plays, and I would recommend it to players who enjoy sandbox titles. But if you're like me and not a huge fan of the sandbox elements, then it does draw upon the question, is there enough in the scenarios to justify purchasing the game? Right now, at the time of review and release of Old World over on Steam, for the next 2 weeks you will have the world maps, Old World, East and West, Mediterranean, Middle East, the Rise of Carthage, Heroes of the Aegean, and the standalone scenario, Barbarian Horde. Not to mention access to all the different mods and scenarios that other players have made with the map editor. And following these 2 weeks, the only thing you'd lose is access to the Heroes of the Aegean. So is there enough to keep you busy? Honestly, I think yes. But would I recommend purchasing these scenario packs as separate DLC? They are good fun and I have thoroughly enjoyed the Heroes of the Aegean playing what I have so far. Definitely provide some pretty interesting narrative gameplay and what are some fairly large campaigns, but I think if I'd paid separately for them, it doesn't really add enough to justify the full expense. If you can get them together or you can purchase a bundle pack, heck yes, go for it. You'll have a lot of fun with the old world. But depending on what price they are when they're released, maybe asking a little too much to get them separately. But either way, that has been the old world brought to bear. Thanks a ton for watching, and as always, peace out.